In this presentation, I will do a deep dive into the formation of the Harappan civilization. Now, the word Harappan is derived from the city of Harappa, which is assumed to be one of the capitals of the civilization which is otherwise referred to as the Indus Valley Civilization. Civilization in this greater Indus region had in fact begun around the 7th millennium BC, that is 9,000 years ago. And this Harappan phase of the Indus Valley Civilization, or the greater Indus Civilization, begins from around 3000 BC. So you have 4,000 years of incipient civilizational development in this greater Indus Valley region before civilization reaches the Harappan phase or the Harappan era. Now, this radical revision of the timeline of Indian history is something that has happened only in the past few decades. The Indus Valley Civilization was first discovered in the beginning of the 20th century. Before that, it was assumed that the history of Indian civilization began from around 1000 BC. And these cities, when they were discovered, they were dated to about 2000 and 2500 BC. So that was a revision backwards of the beginnings of Indian history. And then in subsequent years, there have been various excavations in various regions of northwestern India, and in fact even central India. And we have found sites of Neolithic cultures dating back to 7,000 years and even 9,000 years. So as would be evident from our discussion so far, these sites, they straddle a vast area, which in fact lies divided into three countries today, including southern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Republic of India. So in all, these sites are spread out across a 2,000 square mile area. So this is a vast area and not a localized civilization, such as we saw in Sumeria. So just to get a broad idea of the geography of this vast domain. So the sites belonging to this Indus civilization, as I mentioned, are located on rivers, which either flow into the Indus or are located on dried up courses of old rivers, such as the Sarasvati River. There are also some sub-mountainous regions where these incipient civilizations or incipient cultures developed, and these include Mehrgarh, which is located in the Kachi plain in the Bolan Pass. Mehrgarh is a site in the foothills of Baluchistan, and the earliest settlers here in fact came during the late Stone Age. They were most likely nomadic people and hunter-gatherers. This area was rich in terms of fauna and flora, and many remains of wild animals which have been hunted by the Stone Age people have also been found. So the first human activity in a sense began in this region around 10,000 BC. So this region was occupied for at least 3,000 years before the first settlements of mud bricks began to appear in this region. And this was an important region. This was a convergence point in a sense of three other regions where certain late Stone Age cultures were making a transition into the early Neolithic period as well. So this was of course the greater Iranian highlands, where the ancestors of the Elamite culture were also making a similar transition, and also further southwards towards the center of Baluchistan, where there were other Stone Age people. And of course there were some cultures of the lower plains of the Indus region. So this was a central point where people converged from different zones. So whoever were the first occupiers of this region knew that they had come to a very strategic place. This was in a sense a very geostrategically important place, and they used it to build their settlement and to begin developing their culture. So till around 7000 BC, these first settlers of Mehrgarh still relied on food which was harvested from the wild. Wild varieties of barley were available here, and they also hunted. They hunted goat, sheep, and ancestors of various animals which would soon be domesticated. So from around 7000 BC to around 6000 BC, the first mud brick structures began to develop or emerge in this region. And once these structures began to cluster together, it became a small village, and soon in the village appeared a structure which we can identify as a granary. And as I discussed in the previous episode of the Deep History of Civilization series, granaries are an important signifier of some kind of political hierarchy or political organization. Now, from around 4000 BC, we see another important cultural development. We see that the dead are buried along with important burial grave goods. So, this means that the people who died or the people who were buried with these grave goods were obviously important enough, and how important they were is demonstrated by the kinds of grave goods that we found. So we found grave goods which is jewelry which is inlaid with semi-precious stones. Now these stones themselves are very interesting because they include stones such as lapis lazuli, and lapis lazuli isn't available anywhere in the region. It had to be derived hundreds of kilometers to the north from the province of present-day Badakhshan in Afghanistan in the Pamir Mountains. It is possible there was another source of lapis lazuli somewhere in central Baluchistan. But still, wherever it was far away from Mehrgarh. And we also find, interestingly, seashells. And these seashells have obviously come from the coast of the Arabian Sea. So already around 4000 BC, we see the emergence of these trading networks. There are a few important things to note here. A village develops, a political hierarchy develops. This political hierarchy is sufficient enough or sufficiently complex enough that there is some kind of aristocracy which demands some kind of luxury goods. Remember, the demand for luxury goods only occurs once your basic needs of life are satisfied. And getting these goods from faraway places also requires you to build diplomatic contacts with perhaps nomadic tribes who inhabit the peripheral regions around you. So diplomacy also requires some kind of political hierarchy and representatives to talk on your behalf. And of course, since we see jewelry and we see these highly sophisticated manufactured goods, which are not utilitarian goods like sickles or weapons or utensils, but goods just for ornamentation, you see that the culture has developed some kind of sophistication. And the sophistication is also displayed by other art objects or artistic objects which are created during this time, especially clay figurines. Now, these artistic styles or artistic expressions are also very important for us to identify different cultures, because art, in a sense, is a signifier of culture, of your cultural development, and also of your cultural individuality or the uniqueness of cultures. And through the expression of these artistic designs or various motifs in drawing or in engravings, we can identify that just like Mehrgarh, different cultures were developing in different regions of this greater Indus region. And each of them had their own distinct style of pottery, distinct style of art or engravings on that pottery, and even distinct styles of religion and burial. Now remember, while these villages, they leave behind a trace in the archaeological record. And in the places between these villages, in the vast spaces between them, it should not be assumed that these spaces were empty, because we know for a fact that these places were occupied by nomads. And the presence of nomads is also demonstrated by these trading networks and networks of exchange which were developing between these sites, which, remember, were separated by vast distances and in a sense were still islands of agriculture villages suspended in this vast society which was still dominated by hunter-gatherers. So around the 4th millennium BC, we arrive at a crucial juncture. Around this time, larger and larger areas of this greater Indus region were being integrated through trade, especially by the nomads. And this trade ran through the entire Indus River system, possibly along the river, so possibly there were also some boat people or people who sailed in these rivers, but also through the mountain passes northward, and then of course down the rivers to the coasts from where seashells were derived and possibly also fish and maybe other marine resources. So this central Indus river system acted as a highway in a sense to connect all these various regions, and this integrated world of this greater Indus region began to develop. In Mehrgarh, we see larger and larger houses emerging, and we see, and this shows that the society was affluent, of course, but in these houses we also begin to see things like sealed jars, and they were possibly used to carry vaster quantities of goods. So of course, if the people of Mehrgarh were importing certain commodities, although import might be a slightly anachronistic term, they also had to give something in return. And they were possibly supplying people with grain, supplied in these jars, or possibly other forms of technology, possibly even jewelry. Because remember, around 4000 BC, we also find traces of lapis lazuli, and in fact, a French archaeological mission found a large structure which they identified as a bead making workshop. Now remember, the manufacture of beads requires a lot of sophistication. It requires you to work really intricately with this delicate material. So it shows that a lot of technological development had also happened. So by this time, hundreds of agriculture-based villages had emerged over the past 3000 years. Most of these sites were clustered along two arcs. One along this old arc of the mountains, of the foothills of Baluchistan and the Hindu Kush mountains, and the other cluster was developing in the lower Indus region around the banks of the river Indus. And the most important site here was a site known as Kot Diji. This is in the present day village of Kot Diji. Now remember, in Mehrgarh we had one sign of the emergence of political culture, that was a granary, and granaries are an important sign that political culture has developed. There is some system of aggregation, a structure of accumulation and distribution. In Kot Diji, we see another sign of a maturation or sophistication of political culture, and that is a wall. So we see for the first time around 4000 BC a walled city. Now we have found structural remains of a defensive mud brick wall, which was later laid over with limestone blocks which were brought from nearby hills. So this was a large infrastructure project. Now this defensive wall was about 1.65 meters high, and it had massive bastions or towers at regular intervals. And the wall ran all around this village of Kot Diji. And in the center of this village was another structure which is known as a citadel, but it could have been a residential structure where a lot of people lived in a single residence. And this was also a large structure which was in the center of this entire complex. So a mud wall, a defensive wall with bastions, with towers, with of course a planned city. And Kot Diji was planned also on a grid-like system, which would become very common in the later cities of the Indus Valley Civilization. So all this shows human initiative. Settling a city, planning a city, defending a city needs some kind of leadership. And this could have been a king, or it could have been any other form of aristocracy, perhaps even a priestly class. Although we don't really see signs of large temples as such in Kot Diji, like we did in the cities of Sumeria. So if the idea of a village society was developed or incubated in Mehrgarh, the idea of a fortified city was developed in Kot Diji. But all of this would come together at a third site, that is Harappa, which was on the banks of one of the tributaries of the Indus, north of Kot Diji, on the banks of the river Ravi. Harappa was founded most likely as a camp, an intermediary camp, as the people from Kot Diji, remember Kot Diji was one city, there were other cities around it, and Kot Diji was possibly a regional civilization or a pre-civilizational zone, and it was trading far away. It was a port with a motif of a bull which emerges from Kot Diji, has been found in the northern side of Burzahom in present-day Kashmir. So Kot Diji was trading across this Indus River system northward. And most likely the people who went northward would have found a small village at Harappa, which was founded around 4500 BC. It is possible they stayed there, it is possible they developed some connections. There are some signs of this interaction between the Kot Diji people, the more sophisticated people from the south, and the people of the small village of Harappa. We have found some sherds of pottery dating to about 4000 BC, which are distinctly Kot Dijian in style. Now, how do we know that the site wasn't founded by people from Kot Diji? Because in still earlier layers of Harappa, dating to about 4500 BC, we find a very different kind of pottery. This is pottery which is handmade and it is bright red in color, not very remarkable to look at, but it has an interesting aspect to it. On the outside of this pottery are some signs, which are linear designs, designs of intersecting circles, which are, in a sense, the origins of the characteristic Indus Valley script. Now, at this stage in the history of the greater Indus region, though we do find various artistic motifs such as bulls and leaves of the peepal tree, which will be found in later Indus Valley culture, this is the only place so far where we have found signs of writing, or what would become writing. It is likely that at this point of time, these are only symbols which symbolize something else. But here was the genesis of a script. And possibly this great innovation by some great genius living in Harappa was the reason why this small village, during a time when there were old cultures in Mehrgarh which were 3000 years old, even then in 4000 BC, and these sophisticated walled cities just to the south on the banks of the Indus, why this small village would rise to become a capital of a civilization that would straddle 2000 square miles. Now, before I discuss Harappa and the formation of the Harappan phase of the Indus Valley Civilization, let me just introduce another important region of this greater Indus region. This was just southeast of Harappa, around what is a small river known as the Hakra River. And various settlements around this Hakra River, which is again a seasonal river, were discovered by Pakistani archaeologists in the 60s and 70s. And in fact, they have discovered hundreds of sites in this small cluster around this very small and tiny river. Now, it had been hypothesized even decades before the discovery of this cluster of the Hakra region sites that the Hakra River, along with another river known as the Ghaggar in northern India, were the remnants of the dried up course of an ancient lost river known as the Sarasvati, which is mentioned in the oldest Hindu texts, and it is mentioned most prominently in the Rig Veda. So this was a hypothesized lost river for a while, and various archaeologists have attempted to find the course of this river. Now, the presence of these sites, along with various other sites which were found along this arc of the hypothesized dried up bed, was evidence enough in my view, but in recent years we have also received more evidence from the geosciences, and it is more or less established that the Saraswati did flow and was a prominent river which flowed through this region, and it dried up around 2000 BC. And the drying up of this river would play an important role in the transitionary phase of the Indus Valley Civilization. Now, this transitionary phase was once called the collapse of the Indus Valley Civilization, but as we will see at the end of this lecture, collapse is not the right word. In fact, we should talk about transformation, but that is something we will get to in a while. For now, we return to Harappa at 4000 BC. Now, in this millennium from 4000 BC to 3000 BC, Harappa really began to grow, and it began to grow rapidly. Now, why this rapid growth happened, I would presume because of the contact of the Kot Dijans, Harappa was drawn into the circulation network of this greater Indus region, which I mentioned before. But also because of the technology that the Harappans had developed, that was the technology of writing. So writing possibly helped them to grow and develop a bureaucratic core to provide services to this network of trade which was developing in this greater region. Remember, Harappa is also central if you consider the Hakra region sites just to the southeast. So you have the older sites of the Hindu Kush arc to the west, you have the great cultures of the Sindh region, the great cities of the Sindh region, including Kot Diji to the south, and you have these Hakra zone sites to the southeast. So Harappa is in a sense the central location where all these networks congregate, And Harappa has this geotechnological advantage, this technology of writing. So they can organize and make use of both their geostrategic position and also use their technology, which is, of course, writing is a technology and it is useful for organizing trade. And remember, the Kot Dijans are trading northward. Remember, I mentioned that a pot with this insignia of a bull has been found in the northern side of Burzahom, which is in Kashmir. And remember, I also mentioned that lapis lazuli was traded from the Pamir Mountains coming southward. And of course, seashells from the Arabian Sea coast were traveling northward. So remember, there is this north-south trade happening already. And now we also see a supplementing of this north-south arc with a west-east arc towards these Hakra region sites. And these are hundreds of sites. There are hundreds of small villages. None of the villages in the Hakra region grew to a large size, but there were hundreds of small villages. So it was a densely occupied region. So obviously there was demand for a lot of luxury goods, just like we saw in Mehrgarh. And gradually and very interestingly, we find not just Kot Dijan remains in Harappa, we also gradually begin to find pottery from Baluchistan in Harappa, including some Harappan pottery and Harappan art in the Hakra region sites. Now, as Harappa grew larger and larger as the population increased, it began to develop an interesting urban geography. Remember, I had mentioned in Kot Diji that there was a characteristic feature of the settlement, that there was a defensive wall, and inside the wall, in the walled city, there was a citadel, a central citadel, where the rulers or the ruling class of the city most likely lived. In Harappa, we don't see the development of a wall initially, but we see 4 citadel-like areas developing. So there are 4 mounds, raised mounds, on which certain structures were developed, most likely large and aristocratic dwelling places. And there was a city which developed in the lower regions around these mounds. So it is possible that initially there were 4 distinct ruling groups or ruling classes in the city. Now, another interesting feature of Harappa is, remember, in Mehrgarh and Kot Diji, we had granaries which were located in a central location around the central core area, in the central core area of the settlements. In Harappa, there is no central granary. All granaries are along the edges of the city, edges of the growing city, which is a likely indicator that the control and production of grain was not centralized. And it is also possible that grain was imported from the outside. Remember, there is a cluster of small villages just to the south in the Hakra region. So it is likely that grain was imported from the outside. So it was a growing city and it gives the impression of a trading city. And because of the different kinds of artifacts, it gives the impression of a cosmopolitan city where a centralized Indus culture was beginning to develop. Now, in all of this, we should not deny the force or the power of human initiative in shaping the course of history. We, of course, don't have any historical record of the people who lived in those times, but they were living their lived history and lived reality. And there most likely were enterprising people, innovative people, and great people perhaps who invented writing, who invented the idea of a planned city, and so many others whose names we don't know. We know there was a lot of human initiative in Kot Diji. The Kot Dijan people, after settling the course of the lower Indus, also began expanding southward, across the sea in western India, in the region of present-day Gujarat. So they developed trading colonies there, and this region was rich in natural resources, in minerals, and also in timber, which was necessary for building boats and also useful for building buildings and other important structures. So the Kot Dijans were very enterprising people, and they were expanding all along this entire greatest Indus region. But something happened around 3000 BC, and the main city, Kot Diji, was destroyed. There are some hints that this might have been the consequence of an earthquake, but we have signs of earthquakes in other cities as well. And immediately after earthquakes in sophisticated cities and larger cities, the administration just seems to repair the cities and life seems to return to its normal course. But after this event at Kot Diji, it was followed by a large-scale fire. Again, this is in the archaeological record. And in this fire, most of the city, or in fact all of the city, was destroyed. So this happened just after or around 3000 BC. Now, I mentioned human initiative, and human initiative, of course, showed itself in art, it shows itself in trade, in building, in creating, but also in destruction. So who knows, perhaps there was some great war at 3000 BC. There is a possibility that there might have been a great war at 3000 BC. We of course don't have much evidence of it, but around 3000 BC, Kot Diji was destroyed, and the center of geoeconomic power shifted to Harappa, shifted northward, and the Harappan culture became dominant over all the subcultures of this greater Indus region. And this again is demonstrated by the founding of what is assumed to be the second capital of this greater Indus civilization during the Harappan age, which is the city of Mohenjo-daro. Now, Mohenjo-daro was founded in the south, in Sindh, in the lower course of the Indus River, and it was founded not very far away from the abandoned site of Kot Diji. In fact, across the bank of the Indus River, on the other side of the river. And this city was a distinctly Harappan city in its origin. The main motif of the city, the planning of the city, the urban geography of the city, was based on a Harappan design. Mohenjo-daro is the largest of the Harappan sites that we have found so far, spreading to about 400 hectares if we count the core and the peripheral areas of the city. Now, why do I call it a Harappan site, and why do we call this phase the Harappan phase? Because from now on, across the entire region, we begin to see Harappan culture dominate the culture of this entire region. So remember, Harappa had grown into quite a large city by this time. And as the city grew, there was a need for the city to expand outwards. And this expansion had been planned. And the new sections of the city were laid out on a grid-like pattern, with different sectors assigned to different production facilities, different crafts, and even for traders were carrying out long-distance trade. This grid-based pattern or layout of the city became the core model on which other cities were established, other large cities were established in this entire region during this Harappan phase, beginning of course with Mohenjo-daro. Aside from the layout of cities and the urban geography, we also find distinctly Harappan cultural motifs. Again, the motifs are important, including writing in all cities of this Harappan phase. And of course, there are other things such as bureaucratic management, such as the paraphernalia of trade, which includes weights and also the distinctive seals of the Indus Valley Civilization, all of which display a strong Harappan influence. Of course, this is the dominant influence, but there are influences from other cultures as well. Harappa itself had drawn influences from various cultures, including Kot Diji, and in its later stages also Baluchistan, and possibly also from the west, or from the east. So Mohenjo-daro then, coming to Mohenjo-daro, when it was discovered, it was among the largest sites known in any ancient civilization. It spread to about 400 hectares if we include the suburbs of the city, and it is estimated that at least 40,000 people lived in the core area of the city, and possibly many, many thousands more in the peripheral areas. So this was among the largest cities of the world, comparable to the vast cities of the Sumerian civilization. So the general plan or the layout of the city of Mohenjo-daro is very significant. Apart from the fact that it was founded as a planned city of this vast size, the plan itself became a model for establishing various other cities in this entire region. And two important cities that were established just after Mohenjo-daro was the site known as at Kalibangan, which is located in the Hakra region, just to the east of the core Hakra region, and also another trading site known as Lothal, which is located in the Gujarat region. Now, all these sites, all these cities were strategically chosen. So if Mohenjo-daro was chosen to control the trade or the region around Sindh, which was once the core of the Kot Dijan culture, Kalibangan was chosen to control the region around Hakra and possibly trade flowing from east and possibly even from central India. And Lothal, of course, was a very important, geo-economically important city, which was established to control the trade from, of course, the inland of Gujarat and also across the seas, across the Arabian Sea. So this was human initiative in action, and this was planning in action, planning not just on the scale of cities and the urban geography, but planning on a vast imperial scale perhaps, or the building of an empire which would control this entire region. So before we move downwards and begin looking at individual cities, let's just get an overview of the big picture. So what have we seen in the past 3,000 years? We saw villages, small villages developing in Mehrgarh, the first granaries appearing there, and some kind of a village society, a village-based polity. Then we saw walled cities appearing in Kot Diji, and we saw a network of trade from possibly at the initiative of first the Mehrgarh people and then the Kot Diji people, which spread across this entire Indus region. Harappa was drawn into that network of trade, and gradually, because of its important location and because of the network power which developed due to writing and due to its geostrategic location, Harappa became a center which attracted people towards it and grew into a large city. So once that event happened around 3000 BC, whatever the event was, I am not going to speculate any further. I've already done a lot of that. So once that event happened and Kot Diji was destroyed, the Harappans were in a position to take advantage of the geopolitical picture of the time, and they began to spread their power outwards. They established the city of Mohenjo-daro, which was a Harappan city, and then they established these other cities, which was Kalibangan and also Lothal. So these cities together controlled the entire trading arc of the greater Indus region. But once this was done, once the internal integration of the Harappan civilization had happened, then it was ready to begin looking outwards. And from 3000 BC, this begins to happen. We see sites being developed further and further along the Arabian Sea coast. And all these sites are either trading focused sites. We know that because they are small sites with small settlements and we see a lot of tools there. Or they are sites which have been established in geostrategically important places to control trade routes. And this includes the important site of Sut Kagindor, which is the westernmost site of the Indus Valley Civilization. This is a fortified walled city right on the coast overlooking the Straits of Oman. So we see the civilization spreading out westward and along this coastal arc to control the coastal trade. And around 2600 or 2500 BC, we see another settlement in the north. And this settlement is established in Badakhshan, near the site of Shortugai, present-day Shortugai. And this is the region, this is the zone, this is the place, or these are the mines from which lapis lazuli was supplied southward to the people of Mehrgarh, to the people of Kot Diji. And by establishing this site at Shortugai around 2500 BC, this trading arc of the Harappan culture had spread to a vast and unimaginable domain. Now initially, most likely, a lot of this trade was focused inwards. There are some signs in this intervening period, around 3000 BC, a few centuries here and there, of some interaction with sites in Central Asia, especially in northern Iran. There's also some localized interactions along in the Baluchistan region, perhaps with other cultures of Iran, of southern Iran. But from around 2500 BC, we see the emergence of international trade or inter-civilizational trade. And this happens during the reign of, this happens most prominently during the reign of Sargon the Great of the Akkadian dynasty in Mesopotamia. And that is something that I will pick up on. But before that, I now turn to examine the urban geography of Mohenjo-daro and some other important cities of the Harappan civilization.